Roz's Krantz and Gouldenstein Are Dead is the rather brilliantly titled 15th episode of the 4th season of Frasier. This is directed by Jeff Melman, and as always, there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode and share some thoughts. I don't have as many notes as usual. I think my notes are maybe half as detailed as usual. That doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy the episode. I think it's really great, but I feel like it's more uplifting than it is funny, and that's absolutely not fine. There are times when Frasier is more moving than it is comedic. Of course, we have comedy in there, and for me at least, this is one of those episodes, but that's not really a bad thing. It starts off with Niles and Frasier driving along, and Niles happens to see some people by the side of the road spearing trash, and they realise that one of those people is Roz, and they pick her up, and she kind of encourages them to speed off with her, which probably wasn't wise. And we learn that she was speeding, so she could either have paid a hefty fine or do community service, and she chose the latter. And we'll come back to that in a moment, but then we cut back to the apartment, and Daphne is training with Martin, doing his physical therapy, and Frasier decides that he no longer thinks his work is gratifying. When he worked with patients face-to-face, he'd spend a lot of time with them over an extended period, and he'd see the benefits of the work gradually over time, whereas, as he points out, when somebody phones KCL, he gives them advice, and then we don't hear any more of it. And this theme is important as we go throughout the episode. We're then down at KCL, and he asks callers who had previously phoned in to call back and explain how the advice worked out. Now, that could potentially have gone tragically wrong, because we could have had callers phoning in saying how the advice had backfired. That's not what had happened necessarily. Somebody called in and the advice worked a little too well, but it wasn't as bad as it perhaps could have been. It wasn't as bad as what Frasier was potentially opening himself up to. Roz is actually late for work because one of the older people she went to visit as part of her community service actually died. And understandably, she's very, very distressed about this. And this will come up again in a little bit. We then go back to the apartment. Niles had been at the wedding of one of his patients, and he'd invited Maris along with him, which is interesting for two reasons. One, I think it's the first time he might have been alone with Maris, or at least in public with Maris, since the separation. And the other interesting thing is that Maris agreed to go at all. I found that to be not necessarily the most believable part of the episode, but we do get some comedy out of his anecdotes, so I don't mind that too much at all. And then we're at Frasier's apartment, and Roz arrives, and unfortunately another old person died while she was visiting them. Needless to say, that would be pretty traumatizing, and Roz is really distraught. So Frasier decides to go down to the retirement home with her, and we have this really lovely moment actually between Roz and a character called Moira, played by Lois Smith. And we have this great quote from Moira, actually, and she says, "Don't waste the best years of your life worrying about something you can't control," which I think is absolutely perfect. It's pretty common to worry about getting older, particularly once you hit a certain age, and I guess that it's a very truthful thing. What's the point in worrying about getting older? There is literally nothing you can do to try and slow it down. And you can look after yourself, you can make healthy choices, but it's still not going to slow down the actual concept of aging. So why worry about it? As long as you're doing all of the right things to stay healthy, then that's the best any of us can do. And I think that is a beautiful takeaway for this episode. And we get some comedy with the scene with Roz and Moira, but I feel like that is more moving and uplifting than anything else. While Roz is with Moira, Frasier is talking to a character called Norman, and he is played by James Earl Jones. And this is a blind individual who actually is aware of Frasier because he listens to the radio show, and he thanks Frasier because he helped him. And there we have some validation for Frasier, because as we learned at the beginning, he wasn't really finding his work as gratifying. He wasn't getting that validation that what he was doing was helping people And then Norman provides him with that, which is really sweet. Unfortunately, well, this played out not in a way I was expecting. Frasier accidentally drops and breaks the mask, which is a mould of Norman's wife's face, which is really sweet. And he spends his scenes with Norman trying to fix this. And when Frasier leaves, he comes back and he admits to Norman what had happened, that he'd accidentally broken the mask. And Norman had pointed out that he'd already done it quite a few times himself, which is not what I was expecting it to go, not where I thought it would end up. And I found that to be quite sweet. And of course, honesty is usually the best policy, as Frasier learned. It is an interesting episode. It is very thought-provoking. And if anybody is, like Roz, concerned with their own mortality, I think this episode provides some interesting food for thought and is definitely very well done. So it might not be the funniest episode, but that being said, I still think Roz's Krantz and Gouldenstein Are Dead is a really well done episode and ultimately one that I really enjoyed.